The scent of stale coffee and cheap cologne clung to the air in the cramped recording studio. It was 3 a.m., and the glow of the monitor screen reflected the exhaustion etched onto my face. I was 31, a composer named Bernard B. Sanders, and tonight was supposed to be the night I finished the score for the Community Theater's production of Cyrano. Instead, I was staring at a blank measure, the weight of my life pressing down on every key. My apartment, which doubled as my studio, was in the less desirable part of Brooklyn, a constant reminder of the gap between my artistic dreams and my financial reality. I lived on ramen and ambition, a diet that was wearing thin, especially now that I had someone else to worry about. Her name was Clara. She was a whirlwind of sharp edges and sharper ambition, a rising star in corporate law. We'd been together for 3 years, a relationship fueled initially by mutual admiration. She loved the intensity of my focus. I loved the certainty of hers. But lately, the admiration had curdled into something bitter. The door creaked open, startling me out of my fugue state. Clara stood there, fully dressed in a crisp navy suit, her briefcase gleaming under the dim overhead light. She hadn't bothered to change after a late meeting. Her expression was cold, molded by stress and disappointment. "Still here, Bernard?" Her voice was low, laced with that familiar, weary judgment. I rubbed my eyes. Almost done. Just hitting a wall on the string arrangement for Act 3. She didn't move past the doorway. She just stood there, radiating impatience. "It's 4 in the morning. You know, most people your age are building careers, not scoring amateur plays for $50 and a slice of pizza." A familiar tightness gripped my chest. I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's experience, Clara. It's building the portfolio." "You know that." "I know that you've been building the portfolio since we met," she countered, stepping into the room, her high heels clicking sharply on the bare concrete floor. She gestured dismissively at the complex array of keyboards and mixers surrounding me. "This is a hobby, Bernard. It's not a life." I pushed back from the desk, the swivel chair protesting with a groan. "What do you want, Clara? Why are you here right now?" She sighed, a dramatic suffering sound that always made me feel small. She placed her briefcase on the worn armchair, the leather contrasting starkly with the faded upholstery. "I had dinner with Richard tonight. He just bought a condo in Tribeca. Cash. Good for Richard." I knew where this was going. Richard was her partner at the firm, a man who measured success in square footage and quarterly bonuses. "He asked me what you do, Bernard." I had to tell him you were composing a score about a man with a big nose for the community center. She paused, letting the silence hang heavy. He laughed. My jaw tightened. The sting wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the realization that she had allowed him to laugh at me. "I'm tired of defending you," she finally admitted, her voice cracking slightly, revealing a genuine exhaustion beneath the anger. "I'm tired of paying the rent while you chase ghosts. I need a partner, Bernard, someone who stands beside me, not someone I have to constantly prop up." I looked down at my hands, the hands that could coax emotion from a piano but couldn't seem to generate a stable income. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "Say it, Clara. Just say what you came here to say." She took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto mine, cold and unforgiving. "You are 31 years old. You have no savings, no prospects, and you are utterly, fundamentally worthless." The word hit me like a physical blow. Worthless. It echoed in the small, cluttered room. It wasn't just an insult. It was a verdict on my entire existence, delivered by the person I loved. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Get out, Clara." "I already packed my bags," she said, retrieving a small, expensive duffel bag from behind the chair. "I'm moving in with Richard tonight. He understands ambition." She walked toward the door, her movements precise and final. She didn't look back. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the sterile silence, the word worthless still vibrating in the air. I sat there for a long time, the music forgotten, the future a sudden, terrifying blank. My grandfather, Arthur Sanders, always used to tell me, "Bernard, never let a single person define your value. Only you know the true score." Grandpa Arthur had been my rock, a steady, quiet presence who encouraged my music when my parents pushed for something practical. He had passed away 6 months ago, leaving a void that felt insurmountable. I finally stood up, my legs shaky. I needed air. I needed to escape the memory of her voice. I walked into the tiny kitchen, grabbing a glass of water, trying to wash away the bitterness. As I leaned against the counter, my phone buzzed violently on the charger. It was 4:15 a.m. Who would call at this hour? The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, but beneath it, the name, Marcus Thorne, attorney at law. I hesitated, wondering if this was some cruel joke. Marcus Thorne was Grandpa Arthur's lawyer, a formidable man known for handling the estates of old New York money. Why would he be calling me now? Grandpa's will had been settled months ago. Modest inheritance of his old vinyl collection and the antique piano I used every day. Nothing else. I answered, my voice hoarse. "Hello? Mr. Sanders? Bernard Sanders?" Thorne's voice was deep, formal, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Yes, speaking. Mr. Thorne, is everything all right?" "No, Mr. Sanders, not exactly. I apologize for the hour, but something highly unusual has occurred regarding your grandfather's estate. Specifically, a codicil that was sealed and only activated upon your recent 31st birthday." My heart started to pound, a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. A codicil? Grandpa never mentioned anything about a secret clause. "What is it, Mr. Thorne?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Your grandfather, Arthur B. Sanders, was a very private man, Bernard. He left instructions for me to contact you immediately and schedule a meeting at the New York Mercantile Bank. He stated that a certain item must be retrieved personally by you. It concerns a safe deposit box, number 701. I frowned, confused. "A safe deposit box? What's inside?" Thorne's tone shifted, becoming gravely serious. "Mr. Sanders, I cannot disclose the contents over the phone. But I can tell you this. The contents of that box will fundamentally change every aspect of your life. I suggest you meet me at the bank tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. And Bernard, please, do not speak to anyone about this. Especially not anyone who recently left your life." He hung up before I could ask another question. I stared at the phone, the cold metal smooth against my palm. Worthless, Clara had said. But Grandpa's lawyer, calling in the dead of night, suggesting a secret that could change everything. I walked back to the studio, the word worthless fighting with the image of a massive, impenetrable bank vault. I looked at the unfinished score, the notes suddenly seeming insignificant. What kind of secret could Grandpa Arthur have kept? He was a retired history professor, a man who spent his days reading dusty books and tending his small garden. I sat down at the piano, my fingers hovering over the keys. I couldn't focus on the music. The tension was too high, the mystery too consuming. I kept replaying Thorne's final warning. Asterisk, do not speak to anyone about this. Especially not anyone who recently left your life. Clara was gone, convinced I was a failure. And now, the morning promised a revelation that might prove her spectacularly wrong. I didn't sleep. I just watched the city outside my window slowly turn from black to the gray light of dawn. Waiting for 9 a.m., I felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. My life had been defined by scarcity and striving. Now it felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting for a push. The clock ticked agonizingly slow. I kept thinking about Grandpa Arthur. He always had that knowing look in his eyes, a quiet amusement that suggested he knew something the rest of the world didn't. Was this it? Was this the secret he'd carried all these years? I showered and dressed in the only decent suit I owned, the one I usually reserved for auditions. It felt heavy, like armor. I checked my wallet, $20 and a few crumpled receipts. Worthless, indeed. As I locked the apartment door, I noticed a small, almost imperceptible scratch on the wooden frame right near the lock. It looked fresh, like someone had recently tried to jimmy the door. I dismissed it as paranoia, but a cold knot formed in my stomach. Thorne's warning echoed again. Asterisk, do not speak to anyone about this. I hailed a cab, the urgency of the moment overriding my usual frugality. The cab driver, a man with tired eyes, asked where I was going. The New York Mercantile Bank downtown, I said, trying to sound casual. He raised an eyebrow. Big meeting today, huh? I just offered a tight smile. The drive felt endless, the city rushing past in a blur of concrete and glass. Every passing minute ratcheted up the tension. What if Thorne had the wrong person? What if this was all a mistake? We pulled up to the imposing marble facade of the bank. It was a fortress of old wealth, the kind of place I usually walk past without a second glance. I paid the driver and stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling utterly out of place. I adjusted my tie, took a deep breath, and walked through the massive bronze doors. The lobby was hushed, the air cool and faintly metallic. A security guard, built like a brick wall, nodded curtly as I approached the reception desk. "I'm here to see Mr. Marcus Thorne," I told the receptionist, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. She checked her screen, her expression impassive. "Ah, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Thorne is expecting you. Vault level 3. She handed me a visitor's badge. I walked toward the elevators, my heart hammering against my ribs. Vault level 3. This wasn't just about a few old bonds. This felt serious. This felt like the movies. As the elevator doors closed, I caught a glimpse of a man in the waiting area reading a newspaper. He wasn't looking at me, but something about the way he held the paper, too still, too perfect, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He was wearing a dark suit, nondescript, professional. Just another banker, probably. But the scratch on my door flashed in my mind. The elevator descended, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the machinery. When the doors opened on vault level 3, the atmosphere changed completely. The lighting was dimmer, the security tighter. 2 more guards stood sentinel by a massive steel door. Marcus Thorne was waiting for me, standing beside a small polished mahogany table set up in a private consultation room just outside the vault entrance. He was taller than I remembered, silver-haired, impeccably dressed. He didn't offer a handshake, just a curt nod. "Bernard, thank you for coming promptly. We don't have much time." He gestured toward the table. On it lay a single thick manila envelope sealed with red wax bearing the impression of a complex, unfamiliar crest. "Your grandfather was a meticulous man," Thorne began, his voice low. "He prepared for this moment decades ago. When he passed, the initial will was executed, distributing his visible assets. This codicil, however, was tied to a very specific trigger, your 31st birthday. He wanted to ensure you were mature enough to handle what was coming." I sat down, my mouth dry. "What is coming, Mr. Thorne?" Thorne picked up the envelope, his fingers tracing the seal. "Arthur Sanders wasn't just a history professor, Bernard. That was his cover for the last 30 years. Before that, he had a career that was significantly more complex." He looked me straight in the eye. "The contents of this safe deposit box are tied to a project your grandfather was involved in during the early Cold War, a project involving high-value assets that were supposed to be repatriated to the United States government after the fall of the Soviet Union. Assets that, shall we say, went missing. My mind struggled to process this. Grandpa Arthur? A Cold War operative? It sounded insane. Missing assets? What kind of assets? Thorne finally broke the seal on the envelope, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, a faded, typed inventory list. Gold, Bernard. Specifically, 2 8-tons of gold bullion, recovered from a Nazi train shipment in 1945, intended for the Soviet reserves, but intercepted by a small, clandestine American unit. Your grandfather was the logistics coordinator for that unit. I stared at him, speechless. 2.8 tons of gold. That was an astronomical amount. Thorne continued, his voice steady. The gold was never officially recorded. It was meant to be used for black operations funding. But your grandfather, seeing the corruption and the political maneuvering, decided to secure a portion of it for himself and his team should the need arise. He converted that bullion into liquid assets managed through a complex network of offshore trusts and secured the final, physical proof of ownership in this bank vault. He pushed the inventory list toward me. I scanned the figures, my eyes widening. The current market value, calculated just yesterday, was scrawled at the bottom in Thorne's precise handwriting. The total estimated value, Bernard, Thorne stated, leaning forward, is approximately $88 million. $88 million. The number hung in the air, massive and unbelievable. Just hours ago, Clara had called me worthless. Now I was staring at a fortune that dwarfed her corporate ambition. Thorne stood up. Now we must open the box. The key is in this envelope, but I must warn you, Bernard. Your grandfather's actions were highly illegal, even if morally justified in his eyes. This money is clean now, laundered over decades, but the history is dangerous. And I have reason to believe that the people who originally lost this gold are still looking for it. He handed me a small, tarnished brass key. It felt heavy in my palm. Let's go, Bernard. The bank manager is waiting. We walked toward the massive vault door. My mind was reeling. $88 million. It wasn't just money. It was freedom. It was vindication. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that Clara had been catastrophically wrong. The bank manager, a nervous man named Mr. Davies, greeted us with forced cheerfulness. We were led into the secure area, a narrow corridor lined with thousands of metal boxes. The air here was even colder, smelling faintly of old paper and steel. Thorne pointed to a box near the floor, labeled 701. You must insert the key, Bernard. Only you. My hand trembled slightly as I inserted the brass key. It turned with a satisfying, heavy clunk. Mr. Davies then inserted his master key, and the heavy door of the deposit box swung open. Inside, there wasn't gold bullion or stacks of cash. There was a single, small, antique wooden box inlaid with dark, polished cherry wood. It looked like a jewelry box, utterly unassuming. I reached in and pulled it out. It was surprisingly heavy. Open it, Bernard, Thorne urged, his eyes fixed on the box. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was not jewelry, but a single, thick, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Beside it lay a small, intricately carved silver locket, the kind women wore in the 1940s. The journal contains the full accounting and the access codes to the offshore trusts. Thorne explained, his voice hushed. The locket. I picked up the locket. It was cold and smooth. I pressed the tiny clasp, and it sprang open, revealing 2 small, faded photographs. One was of a young, handsome Arthur Sanders in a military uniform I didn't recognize. The other was of a beautiful woman with striking, dark eyes. Thorn leaned closer. That woman was Ilara Volkov, a Russian cryptographer. She was your grandfather's partner in the operation, and briefly, his lover. She was the one who provided the key intelligence needed to secure the assets. He paused, a shadow crossing his face. She was also the reason the people who lost the gold know exactly who to look for. I looked at the photos, the weight of history suddenly crushing. This wasn't just about money. It was about secrets, betrayal, and a decades-old conflict. Ilara was killed in 1953, shortly after the gold was secured, Thorn whispered. The people who killed her were looking for this box. They never found it, but they never stopped looking. I felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the cool air of the vault. I wasn't just rich. I was a target. Who were they, Mr. Thorn? They called themselves the operatives, Thorn said, his voice grim. They were KGB operatives, a shadow unit dedicated to recovering Soviet assets and eliminating traitors. They are ruthless, Bernard. And they operate outside the law. He pointed to the journal. You must memorize the information in that journal immediately. Then we destroy the physical evidence. We cannot leave any trace. I nodded, my mind racing. I had $88 million and a target painted on my back. The feeling of being worthless was gone, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating sense of purpose. I opened the journal, the smell of old paper filling my nostrils. The script inside was Arthur's familiar, elegant handwriting. The first page contained a single, cryptic instruction written in thick black ink. Asterisk, the music is the key. The score is the map. I looked up at Thorn, bewildered. The music? What does that mean? Thorn shook his head, looking genuinely perplexed. I have no idea, Bernard. Your grandfather was a man of riddles, but we must hurry. We are exposed here. As if on cue, the bank manager, Mr. Davies, suddenly cleared his throat, his face pale. He was looking past us toward the main entrance of the vault corridor. Mr. Thorn, sir, Davies stammered, his voice trembling. There are 2 gentlemen here. They say they have an appointment. Thorn spun around, his eyes narrowing instantly. Did they give names? They didn't, sir, but they look official. Very serious. Thorn grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Bernard, put the journal and the locket in your inner coat pocket. Now. We are leaving through the service exit. They found us. The operatives. They were here. I hadn't even had time to process the money, and already the ghosts of the Cold War were closing in. I quickly tucked the items away. Who told them I was here? I whispered, the panic rising in my throat. Thorn looked grim. I only told 2 people about this meeting, Bernard. Myself and the person who monitored your grandfather's estate for the last 6 months. He paused, his eyes flashing with sudden, terrible realization. Clara. My stomach dropped. Clara, who had access to my grandfather's initial estate files through her firm. Clara, who had just called me worthless and walked out the door. She hadn't just left, she had set a trap. We need to move, Bernard. Now. Thorn pulled me toward a heavy, unmarked steel door at the back of the consultation room. He punched a code into a keypad, and the door hissed open, revealing a narrow, dusty stairwell leading down into darkness. This is the old maintenance shaft, Thorn explained, pushing me through. It leads to a sub-level garage. Stay low, stay quiet. And Bernard, do not lose that journal. It's the only proof you have. We started descending the stairs quickly, the sound of our footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. I could hear muffled voices from the vault corridor above us, deep Slavic accents, speaking with chilling authority. They were inside the bank. I clutched the journal and the locket inside my jacket. My mind was a chaotic mess of betrayal, fear, and $88 million. Clara hadn't just insulted me. She had sold me out. We reached the bottom of the stairs, emerging into a vast, dimly lit parking garage, smelling strongly of oil and exhaust fumes. Thorne immediately spotted a black sedan parked discreetly in a corner. "My car. Get in the back seat. We need to disappear into the city." We scrambled into the car. Thorne started the engine, the powerful hum a comforting sound in the silence. He drove slowly toward the exit ramp, trying not to attract attention. As we approached the ramp, a large, dark SUV suddenly blocked the exit, its headlights blinding us. Two men, built like professional athletes, stepped out. They were wearing expensive, tailored suits, but their expressions were cold, predatory. Thorne slammed on the brakes. Damn it. They anticipated the escape route. He threw the gear shift into reverse, tires squealing as he tried to back up. But another car, a silver Mercedes, appeared instantly behind us, cutting off our retreat. We were boxed in. "Stay down, Bernard," Thorne commanded, reaching under his seat. He pulled out a small, heavy revolver, the metal cold and functional. "Mr. Thorne, are you armed?" I stammered, utterly stunned. "Your grandfather insisted I be prepared," he replied, his voice tight. He knew this day might come. The two men from the SUV approached our car, moving with a terrifying, practiced efficiency. One of them, a man with a scarred face and eyes like chips of blue ice, tapped sharply on Thorne's driver's side window. Thorne lowered the window just an inch. "May I help you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We are looking for the property of Arthur Sanders," the scarred man said, his English precise but heavily accented. "We know you have the box, Mr. Thorne. Give us the journal, and we let the young man walk away." "I don't know what you're talking about," Thorne lied smoothly. The scarred man smiled, a terrifying lack of humor in the gesture. "Don't insult my intelligence. We have been waiting 50 years for this. We know the codicil was activated. We know the composer, Bernard Sanders, is the key." He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. "And we know the young woman, Clara, was very helpful in confirming his location this morning." My blood ran cold. Clara had confirmed my location. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had actively delivered me to these people. Thorne raised the gun slightly, keeping it hidden below the dashboard. "You'll have to go through me." The scarred man laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "That can be arranged." He stepped back, raising his hand. Before Thorne could react, the man in the Mercedes behind us fired a single shot. Not at us, but at the rear tire of Thorne's sedan. The tire exploded with a deafening thwomp, sending the car lurching violently. Thorne cursed, the distraction momentary but fatal. Scarface immediately smashed the driver's side window with the butt of his own weapon, shards of glass showering the interior. He reached in and grabbed Thorne's arm, twisting it sharply. Thorne cried out in pain, the revolver clattering onto the floor mat. "The journal," Scarface demanded, his face inches from Thorne's. I knew I had to move. I couldn't let them take it. I fumbled for the journal in my pocket. I looked around wildly. There was a small, dark service entrance door about 20 feet away, leading to the street level. "He doesn't have it," I shouted, trying to draw their attention. Scarface looked back at me, his eyes blazing. "Check the boy." The second man from the SUV, a brute with a shaved head, yanked open my door. He grabbed me by the collar, dragging me out of the car and slamming me against the cold concrete pillar. The impact knocked the wind out of me. "Where is it, composer?" The brute growled, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes. I struggled, trying to keep my hand pressed against my inner pocket. He started patting me down, his movements rough and efficient. He found the journal immediately. "Here!" he yelled triumphantly, pulling the leather-bound book out. Scarface turned, a look of pure satisfaction on his face. "Excellent. Now, Mr. Thorne, you and the boy can go." He didn't sound like he was letting us go. He sounded like he was delivering a death sentence. Scarface took the journal from the brute. He opened it, flipping through the pages quickly, confirming the handwriting and the content. Then he looked back at me, his smile widening. "The music is the key. The score is the map," he read aloud, his accent thick. He looked confused for a moment, then shrugged. "A final riddle. Doesn't matter. We have the accounting." He pocketed the journal. The brute still had me pinned against the pillar, my head throbbing. "What about the locket?" I asked, trying to buy time, knowing I still had the silver locket hidden. Scarface paused, his eyes narrowing. "What locket?" "The one that was in the box," I insisted. "It had photos." He looked at the brute, who shook his head. "Only the book, sir." Scarface hesitated, clearly debating whether to search me again. He decided against it. The journal was the prize. "It is irrelevant," he declared. "We have the money. Dispose of the lawyer. The composer. Leave him here. Let him contemplate his worthlessness." The brute raised his fist. I braced myself for the blow, knowing I was about to pay the price for a secret I hadn't even known existed 12 hours ago. But before the fist connected, Thorne, who had managed to free himself from Scarface's grip, shouted, "Bernard, run!" Thorne launched himself at Scarface, tackling him hard against the side of the SUV. The brute holding me hesitated for a crucial second, distracted by the sudden violence. I seized the opportunity. I shoved myself away from the pillar, my body fueled by pure adrenaline, and sprinted toward the service door. I fumbled with the handle, my hands slick with sweat and fear. I heard a muffled gunshot behind me, followed by a sickening thud. I didn't look back. I burst through the door and onto the street, blinded by the sudden sunlight. I ran until my lungs burned, disappearing into the chaotic anonymity of downtown Manhattan. I ran until I reached a crowded subway station, plunging into the underground labyrinth. I leaned against a cold tile wall, trying to catch my breath, the metallic smell of the subway overwhelming my senses. My heart was still racing, the image of Thorne falling replaying in my mind. He had sacrificed himself for me. I pulled out the locket, the only thing I had left from the vault. The photos of Grandpa Arthur and Ilara stared back at me. I was alone, hunted, and holding a key to a fortune that was now in the hands of the operatives. I had to get the journal back. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about avenging Thorne and understanding Grandpa Arthur's final, cryptic message. Asterisk, the music is the key. The score is the map. I needed to find a place to hide, and I needed to figure out what kind of map an $88 million score could possibly be. I knew one thing: I couldn't go home. Clara knew where I lived, and so did the man who had just tried to kill me. I took the subway uptown, riding the rails aimlessly, trying to blend in with the morning commuters. I needed a plan, and I needed to understand the history I had just inherited. I pulled out my phone, resisting the urge to call the police. Thorne had warned me about the illegality of the assets. I needed to research the operatives, the Cold War gold, and Ilara Volkov. I found a quiet, dimly lit internet cafe in Harlem. I ordered a coffee and settled into a dark corner, opening my laptop. The search results were sparse, mostly obscure historical documents and declassified CIA reports. The operatives were indeed a mythic, terrifying shadow unit, rumored to have been disbanded decades ago. Clearly, the rumors were false. I focused on Ilara Volkov. The search led me to an archived article from a 1950s intelligence journal. It described her as a brilliant, young Soviet cryptographer who defected in 1952, carrying vital information regarding Soviet operations in Western Europe. The article mentioned her sudden violent disappearance in 1953, theorized to be an assassination by her former handlers. The article also mentioned her passion, music. Specifically, she was a trained pianist and composer known for her complex, mathematically precise scores. Asterisk, the music is the key. The score is the map. Suddenly, the riddle clicked into place. If Alara was a composer and Grandpa Arthur had worked with her, the score might not be a metaphor. It might be a literal piece of music. But which one? Grandpa had left me his entire vinyl collection and his antique piano. I hadn't thought much of the collection, mostly classical composers, some jazz. But what if one of those scores was the map? I had to risk going back to my apartment. I needed the piano, the sheet music, and the vinyl. But I couldn't walk in blindly. I called the only person I trusted implicitly, a former college roommate named Leo, who now worked as a freelance security consultant, a fancy term for a high-end lockpicker and surveillance expert. Leo, it's Bernard. I need a favor. A big one. I need you to check my apartment for surveillance and intruders, now. Leo's voice was instantly serious. Bernard, you sound like you just ran a marathon. What's going on? I can't explain over the phone. Just tell me if the coast is clear. If you see two large men in dark suits, don't engage. Just call me back. He agreed, his curiosity clearly piqued. I waited, pacing the small cafe, sipping the bitter coffee. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, my phone vibrated. It was Leo. Bernard, listen carefully. The place is empty, but someone was definitely here. The lock was tampered with, professional job. They didn't break in, they picked it. And there's a small, almost invisible camera taped above your fire alarm, facing the piano. They were watching the piano. They were watching the music. Did they take anything? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Looks like they were looking for something specific. Your sheet music is scattered everywhere. They didn't touch your instruments, but the shelves where you keep the old vinyl records are completely empty. They took all of Grandpa Arthur's collection. My heart sank. The journal, the accounting, was gone. And now, the map, the scores were also gone. The operatives had everything. I felt a wave of despair wash over me, quickly followed by a surge of cold fury. They had taken my inheritance, they had likely killed Thorne, and they had been led right to me by Clara. But wait. Leo said they took the vinyl records and the sheet music. They took the collection. I remembered something Grandpa Arthur told me when he gave me the antique piano. Bernard, never trust a container. The value is always in what's hidden inside the container. I had to assume the operatives were operating on the same assumption I had, that the map was a physical score or a coded message within the music itself. But what if the map wasn't in the collection they took? What if it was in the one piece of music they didn't take? My own composition. The score I had been struggling with for Kirano. I rushed back to the subway, heading straight for the community theater where I had left my laptop and the only complete copy of the score. I had to find a flaw in the operatives' logic, a blind spot. I arrived at the theater, a dusty, old building with a faint smell of mildew and grease paint. The stage was dark. I found the rehearsal room and powered up my laptop. The file for the Kirano score glowed on the screen. I looked at the notes, the complex string arrangements, the soaring melodies. It was my music, my creation. Could Grandpa Arthur have possibly hidden a map inside my own work? I remembered the first page of the journal. Asterisk, the music is the key. The score is the map. I started analyzing the score, looking for anything unusual. A strange sequence of notes? A hidden message in the time signatures? Nothing jumped out. It was just a demanding, emotional score. Then I focused on the string arrangement for Act 3, the section I had been stuck on last night, the very section Clara had mocked. I noticed a small, almost imperceptible detail. In the final measure of the main theme, there was a sequence of 5 grace notes, quick ornamental notes played just before the main note. They were musically unnecessary, an odd flourish I had added weeks ago, almost subconsciously. I looked closer at the grace notes C, A, G, E, D. I played the sequence on the small digital keyboard attached to my laptop. It sounded slightly dissonant, a momentary flicker of tension before the resolution. C, A, G, E, D. I realized those weren't just notes. They were letters. And they corresponded to the first 5 letters of the alphabet. If you started counting from C, I pulled out the locket again, looking at the faded photo of Ilara Volkov. She was a cryptographer. She specialized in mathematically precise codes. I started working backward, applying a simple musical cipher. If C equals 1, then D equals 2, E equals 3, F equals 4, G equals 5, A equals 6, B equals 7. I applied the numbers to the notes in the grace note sequence. C, 1, A, 6, G, 5, E, 3, D, 2. 16532. What did that number sequence mean? A phone number? A date? I looked back at the article about Ilara Volkov. She was assassinated in 1953. The number 53 was prominent. I tried another approach. What if the notes represented coordinates? I went back to the score, looking for other anomalies. I found another set of hidden notes, this time in the bassoon part of the overture. A sequence of 3 notes played unusually low, F hash, G hash, A hash. F hash, G hash, A hash. These were sharps. In musical notation, sharps often looked like the hash symbol, hash. I searched the CIA archives again, this time for Arthur Sanders and code. I found a heavily redacted document referencing a Cold War communication method known as the Sanders-Volkov grid. It was a complex system of musical notation used to transmit geographical coordinates. The system used the notes of the scale to represent numbers and the sharps and flats to represent modifiers. The key was the starting point, the tonic. I looked at the Kirano score. The key signature was C major. I realized the grace notes, Kia GD, were not the map itself, but the key to the map. They were the access code to unlock the true score. I started inputting the numbers 16532 into a coordinate generator, using the C major scale as the base. The generator required a 6-digit sequence for latitude and a 7-digit sequence for longitude. I was missing information. I needed the full score, the one that had been stolen. But wait, I had composed this score. I knew every note. I focused on the overall structure of the Kirano score. It was divided into 3 acts, each containing 5 major movements. I realized the map wasn't in a single sequence of notes. It was in the entire structure of the composition. Grandpa Arthur had taught me that the most complex music often hid its structure in plain sight. I started mapping the movements using the 16532 sequence as a filter. It was a complex process, requiring me to cross-reference the number of measures in each movement with the tempo markings. Hours passed. My fingers flew across the keyboard, calculating, cross-referencing, translating musical structure into numerical data. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a deep, focused concentration. I was no longer just a composer. I was a cryptographer, following a trail laid down 50 years ago. Finally, the numbers resolved. I had a full set of coordinates, 40, 7128N, 74, 0060Ju, I typed the coordinates into a mapping program. The location that popped up was instantly recognizable. It wasn't an offshore bank or a secret bunker. It was the New York Public Library, specifically the main branch on Fifth Avenue. I stared at the screen, confused. The library? Why would $88 million be hidden in a public library? Then I remembered the history professor cover. Grandpa Arthur loved that library. He spent countless hours there, researching. I zoomed in on the map. The coordinates pointed precisely to the Rose main reading room, specifically the massive, ornate ceiling mural depicting the history of the written word. I needed to get inside. But I was still a fugitive, and the operatives had the journal and the stolen scores. They would eventually figure out the musical cipher too. I had to assume they were already working on it. I closed my laptop. I had the location, but I needed a plan to retrieve whatever was hidden there, and I needed to ensure my own safety. I called Leo again, using a burner phone I bought from a street vendor. Leo, I need you to meet me. Bring me the tools you use for high-end lockpicking. And bring a pair of binoculars. We're going to the library. He didn't ask questions this time. He just gave me a meeting spot in Central Park. As I walked toward the park, I felt the locket pressing against my chest. I opened it one last time, looking at Alara's intense, dark eyes. She was the key to understanding the danger. I realized I couldn't face the operatives alone. I needed leverage. And I needed to use the person who had betrayed me, Clara. I needed to find her. Not to exact revenge, but to use her knowledge of the legal system and, more importantly, her access to Richard's corporate network. She had sold me out for ambition. Now I would use that same ambition against her. I knew where she was. Richard's new condo in Tribeca. I changed my direction, heading south. I had to confront the woman who called me worthless before I could claim a fortune that would redefine the word. I arrived at Richard's building, a sleek, modern tower of glass and steel. I waited across the street, watching the main entrance. I felt a cold, calculated rage replacing the earlier fear. I saw Clara emerge, impeccably dressed, talking animatedly on her phone. She looked confident, successful, completely unaware of the chaos she had unleashed. I crossed the street and walked directly toward her. Clara. She stopped dead, dropping her phone. It clattered on the pristine sidewalk. She looked terrified, her composure shattering instantly. Bernard, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. I know, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I just wanted to thank you for the introduction to the operatives. They were very interested in Grandpa's assets. Her face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. I just told Richard about the will, about the codicil. He thought it was suspicious, that's all. Suspicious enough to call a group of Russian operatives who specialize in recovering Soviet gold? I countered, stepping closer. Don't lie, Clara. They knew exactly where I was. They killed Thorne. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I saw the calculation behind them. I didn't know they were dangerous. Richard said they were just investors who wanted to buy the claim. $88 million, Clara. You sold me out for Richard's Tribeca condo. She looked down, shame warring with self-preservation. I thought you were worthless, Bernard. I thought you were going to drag me down. Well, you were wrong, I said, pulling the locket from my pocket. And now you have a choice. You can go back to Richard and wait for the operatives to clean up their loose ends, which includes anyone associated with the gold. Or you can help me get it back. She looked at the locket, then back at me, her eyes widening with a sudden dawning realization of the scale of the fortune. The ambition was back, overriding the fear. Help you how? She whispered. You know the law. You know corporate structures. I have the location of the final piece of the puzzle. But I need to know what Richard told those men, and I need a distraction. They think they have the map. They don't. I explained the musical cipher, the coordinates, and the library. She listened, her lawyer's brain rapidly processing the information. If the gold is tied to a Cold War operation, the U.S. government might have a claim, she mused, tapping her chin. We need to establish ownership fast. Richard's firm specializes in international asset recovery. He probably contacted them to cut a deal, thinking he could take a percentage. He gave them the journal, Clara. They have the accounting. I have the location. We need to beat them to the library. She looked at me, a flicker of the old admiration returning, mixed with shock. You figured out the code? You actually did it? I'm not worthless, Clara. I'm a composer. She made her decision. The lure of $88 million and the chance to outsmart Richard was too strong. Okay, Bernard. I'm in. But if we pull this off, I want 10%. I almost laughed. Even facing death, she was negotiating. 5%. And you give me everything Richard told you about the Opportunities operation. She hesitated, then nodded. Deal. Richard told them that the key to the assets was tied to a legacy project of Arthur Sanders. He gave them the initial estate documents, which mentioned the piano and the music collection. They are looking for a physical score. They have it, I confirmed grimly. Which means they're running the cipher right now. We have hours, maybe less. We need to move. And Bernard, if they catch us, they won't just kill us. They'll make it look like an accident or a suicide. We drove toward Central Park to meet Leo, Clara's expensive sedan a stark contrast to my usual subway ride. I felt a strange alliance forming with the woman who had ruined my life. We were united by greed and the desperate need for survival. Leo was waiting for us, leaning against a park bench, looking completely relaxed in a denim jacket and dark sunglasses. He raised an eyebrow when he saw Clara. Bernard, you brought the corporate liar? This just got interesting. I introduced them quickly, explaining the urgency, omitting the betrayal. Leo, we need to get into the New York Public Library after hours. Specifically, the Rose Reading Room. We need to be discreet, and we need to be fast. Leo smiled, pulling a small leather kit from his backpack. The library uses century-old mechanical locks. Easy. But the internal security is motion sensors and pressure plates. We'll need to bypass the system. Clara, the pragmatist, interjected. We can't just break in. We need a legal cover. I can call Richard's firm and claim we need access to the archives for an emergency legal review of a historical document. It won't hold up long, but it will buy us a window. Do it, I said. Leo, how long do you need to get us past the main entrance? 15 minutes tops. But the real problem is the opportunity. If they figure out the coordinates, they'll be there too. We need to assume they are already watching the building. We parked Clara's car several blocks away and approached the library on foot. The massive stone structure loomed before us, silent and imposing in the twilight. Clara made the call, her voice smooth and authoritative, weaving a complex legal fiction about an urgent subpoena. It was enough to get a nervous, low-level security guard to agree to meet us at the staff entrance in 30 minutes. That buys us an hour inside, Clara reported, hanging up. But we need to be out before the senior staff arrives. We met the guard, a young man named Kevin, who looked utterly miserable. Clara flashed her corporate ID and spoke in rapid legal jargon, overwhelming him. He reluctantly led us through the labyrinthine back corridors of the library. We finally reached the doors to the Rose Reading Room. It was breathtaking, even in the dim emergency lighting. The vast space, the towering bookshelves, and the magnificent ceiling mural. The coordinates point to the center of the mural, I whispered, pointing upward. How do we get up there? Kevin, the guard, pointed to a small enclosed glass elevator used for maintenance tucked away in the corner. Only authorized staff uses that. It's keyed. Leo stepped forward. No problem. I can bypass the key. He worked quickly, his fingers deft and precise on the control panel. The lock clicked open. We need to hurry, Clara urged, checking her watch. Richard will start asking questions soon. We rode the small elevator up to the scaffolding level, which was used for cleaning and restoration of the mural. The air up here was dusty and smelled of old varnish. We stepped onto the narrow walkway high above the reading tables. The mural was massive, the figures of history and literature staring down at us. The coordinates pointed to the central figure, a woman holding a scroll representing knowledge. I walked toward the center, shining my phone flashlight. I ran my hand over the painted surface, feeling the texture of the old canvas. Nothing. It was solid. Bernard, are you sure about the coordinates? Clara asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The code was precise, I insisted. It has to be here. I looked closer at the mural, focusing on the scroll held by the figure of knowledge. The scroll was painted with faint, stylized script. I remembered the locket. Elara Volkov, the cryptographer. I looked at the script on the scroll. It wasn't Latin or Greek. It was musical notation disguised as ancient text. I traced the notes with my finger. They were the same 5 grace notes, C, A, G, E, D, the key to the map. But beneath the scroll, painted into the folds of the woman's gown, was a small, almost invisible detail, a tiny painted silver locket identical to the one in my pocket. I pressed the locket against the painted locket on the mural. Nothing happened. I realized the locket wasn't just a sentimental object. It was a physical key. I opened the locket, exposing the 2 faded photographs. I noticed that the back of the locket, where the photos rested, was slightly recessed. I pressed the 2 photos firmly against the painted locket on the mural. There was a faint, almost silent click. A small section of the mural, about the size of a book, slid inward, revealing a dark recess behind the canvas. We found it, I breathed, reaching into the cavity. My fingers closed around a thick, heavy object wrapped in oilskin. I pulled it out. It was a book, bound in dark leather, much older than the journal the operatives had stolen. I unwrapped the oilskin. The book was titled The Collected Works of Arthur B. Sanders, 1945 to 1953. It wasn't a history book. It was a ledger. I opened it. Inside, written in Arthur's elegant hand, were not just the accounting details, but the original, notarized documents establishing the offshore trusts, the transfer details, and crucially, the original deed of ownership for the 2 8 tons of gold bullion signed by members of the clandestine unit. This was the proof. This was the true score. The journal the operatives had stolen was just a decoy, a distraction. This is it, I whispered, handing the ledger to Clara. This is the ownership. We need to get this to a safe place. Clara's eyes gleamed as she examined the documents. This is ironclad. With this, we can freeze the assets before they can access them, even with the codes from the journal. Suddenly, the silence of the reading room was shattered. A loud metallic clank echoed from the floor below. They're here, Leo whispered, grabbing his kit. They must have cracked the code faster than we thought, or they followed us. We heard heavy footsteps approaching the maintenance elevator. We were trapped on the scaffolding high above the ground. We can't go down the elevator, I said. They'll be waiting. I looked across the vast space. The scaffolding extended to the far side of the room near the main entrance. We have to cross the room on the scaffolding, I instructed. Clara, Hold on to that ledger like your life depends on it. Leo, can you create a diversion? Already on it, Leo said, pulling out a small electronic device. He activated it, and a piercing, high-pitched alarm began to shriek from the opposite end of the library near the archives. The footsteps below paused, then shifted direction, heading toward the sound of the alarm. We had a few minutes. We started moving quickly, silently, along the narrow metal walkway. The distance was terrifying, the drop below dizzying. As we reached the halfway point, the maintenance elevator doors opened and Scarface stepped out, followed by the brute. They had ignored the diversion. Scarface looked up, his eyes immediately finding us in the dim light. He smiled, a truly terrifying expression. "The composer," he called out, his voice echoing in the massive room. "You are more clever than I thought. You found the true map." He raised his gun, aiming directly at us. "Stop right there, or I shoot the lawyer." Clara gasped, clutching the ledger to her chest. I knew I couldn't outrun a bullet. I had to use the only weapon I had left, the music. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, electronic keyboard I used with my laptop, the one I had used to test the grace notes. It was small, but functional. I quickly plugged it into a small speaker Leo carried for testing audio frequencies. I had an idea, a desperate, insane one. I started playing the 5 grace notes, C, A, G, E, D, but this time I played them not as a cipher, but as a dissonant, high-frequency chord, repeating the sequence rapidly, pushing the sound through the speaker. The sound was agonizing, a high-pitched whine that resonated horribly in the massive, enclosed space of the reading room. Scarface flinched, covering his ears. The brute stumbled, momentarily blinded by the sonic assault. "It's a sonic frequency designed to disrupt balance," Leo yelled over the noise. "It won't last long." I kept playing the sequence, hammering the keys, turning the music into a weapon. "Go!" I yelled at Clara and Leo. They scrambled toward the far end of the scaffolding. Scarface, recovering quickly, fired a shot. The bullet whizzed past my head, ricocheting off the metal railing with a sharp ping. I stopped playing, the sudden silence deafening. Scarface was advancing, his face contorted in fury. I looked down at the floor, far below. I had one last chance. I took a running leap, jumping off the scaffolding and grabbing onto the massive, ornamental chandelier that hung directly below the mural. My hands gripped the cold, brass chains. The chandelier swung violently, groaning under my weight. I was dangling 30 feet above the marble floor. Scarface rushed to the edge of the scaffolding, looking down at me. "You fool! You'll break your neck." I ignored him. I used the momentum of the swing to propel myself toward the nearest towering bookshelf, aiming for the top shelf. I slammed into the shelf, knocking over stacks of ancient, dusty books. The impact was jarring, but I held on, scrambling onto the narrow ledge of the bookshelf. Scarface fired again, the bullet hitting the bookshelf just inches from my head. The sound was deafening. I was now perched precariously on the top of the bookshelf, using the books as cover. I had the high ground, but I was exposed. Clara and Leo had reached the far side and were descending the maintenance stairs. "Bernard, hurry!" Clara shouted. I looked back at Scarface, who was now carefully making his way along the scaffolding, closing the distance. I reached for the nearest stack of books-heavy, leather-bound volumes of philosophy. "You want the score?" I yelled. "Here's the final movement." I shoved the stack of books off the shelf, sending a cascade of ancient texts raining down onto the marble floor. The sound was like thunder. The books crashed onto the floor, directly in the path of the brute who was now entering the room. He slipped on the scattered volumes, falling hard, his gun skittering across the floor. Scarface, momentarily distracted by the noise, paused. That was all I needed. I jumped from the bookshelf onto a lower, wider ledge, then slid down a decorative column, landing hard on the floor. I was bruised and shaking, but free. I ran toward the maintenance stairs, joining Clara and Leo. We raced down the stairs and burst out into the back corridor, the alarm still shrieking in the distance. "We need to get out of the city," I gasped, clutching my side. "They won't stop." Clara, holding the ledger tightly, was already thinking ahead. "We need to get to the firm's private jet hangar. We can be airborne in an hour. Richard won't know until morning." We left the library, disappearing into the night. We drove south toward the private airport in New Jersey, the ledger resting between us, the true $88 million score finally in my possession. As we crossed the bridge, the city lights shimmering behind us, I looked at Clara. She was pale, but exhilarated. "You were right, Bernard," she admitted, her voice low. "You're not worthless. You're terrifying." "You shouldn't have called me that," I replied, the bitterness still sharp. We reached the hangar just before dawn. Clara used her corporate access to bypass security. Richard's sleek 10-seater jet was waiting on the tarmac, engines already warming up for an early morning flight he had scheduled. We boarded the jet. As we taxied toward the runway, Clara made a series of urgent calls, using the information in the ledger to contact the international banks and freeze the offshore trusts. She moved with a ruthless efficiency that was chilling and impressive. "It's done," she announced, hanging up the satellite phone. "The assets are frozen. They can't touch the money, even with the journal." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The money was safe. "Now we need to deal with the operatives," I said. "They are still hunting us. They will realize the journal was a decoy when they try to access the funds," Clara predicted. "And they know we have the ledger. We need to disappear for a while." We flew toward a remote location in the Caribbean, a small, private island owned by one of Richard's shell corporations, a place where no one would think to look for us. As the plane climbed, I looked out the window, watching the sun rise over the Atlantic. I was no longer the struggling composer in a cramped Brooklyn apartment. I was a man with a secret, a fortune, and a target on his back. I opened the ledger again. I needed to understand the full extent of Grandpa Arthur's plan. The last page contained a final note, written in the same elegant script. ** Bernard, the money is yours. But the true inheritance is the music. It is the language of freedom. Do not let the pursuit of wealth silence your score." I realized the $88 million was the means, not the end. The real victory was proving I wasn't worthless, not to Clara, but to myself. We landed on the small island. It was paradise, but the danger was still real. We had bought time, but the operatives were relentless. Clara immediately started building a legal fortress around the assets, using the ledger to establish my legitimate claim. I started researching how to use the funds to honor Thorne and expose the operatives. 2 days later, I received an encrypted message on the satellite phone. It was from Leo. "Bernard, I have news. Thorne is alive. Badly injured, but alive. He's in a secure location, recovering. He wants you to know he's proud of you." A huge weight lifted from my shoulders. Thorne was safe. "Also," Leo continued, "I tracked the operatives. They are furious. They realize the journal was fake. They are focusing their search on the person who led them to you." "Clara?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. "No, Richard. They believe he deliberately misled them to buy time for his own firm to intercept the assets. They are currently dismantling his corporate network. Clara's betrayal had inadvertently saved us by making Richard the primary target. Her ambition had finally caught up with him. I looked at Clara, who was intensely focused on a legal brief. She caught my eye. "What is it?" she asked. "Richard is in trouble," I said simply. She didn't react with pity, only calculation. He should have been more careful about who he dealt with. I realized then that Clara would never truly change. She was defined by her ambition. I spent the next few weeks working with Clara to secure the assets, but I kept my distance. We were partners in survival, nothing more. Once the legal framework was secure, I made my decision. I didn't want the life of a hunted millionaire. I wanted my music. I established a foundation in Grandpa Arthur's name, dedicating 90% of the $88 million to funding international music education and supporting artists struggling for recognition. I kept a modest amount enough to secure my future and establish a proper studio. I called Clara into the room. She looked triumphant, expecting a full partnership. "The assets are secure," I told her. "The foundation is established. You get your 5%, Clara. It's wired to your account. It's enough to buy 10 Tribeca condos." Her eyes widened with shock and delight. "Bernard, you're giving it all away? Why?" "Because the money was never the point," I said, looking at the locket. "The point was the freedom to choose my own score. I'm going back to New York. I have a life to live. But the operatives will still be looking for you. They'll be looking for the man who controls $88 million. That's no longer me. They'll be chasing the foundation's board members who are protected by layers of international law. I'm just a composer again." I left the island that afternoon, leaving Clara behind to manage her new fortune and her corporate ambitions. I returned to New York, not to my old apartment, but to a small, quiet loft in a different neighborhood. I visited Thorne, who was recovering well, and thanked him for his sacrifice. I sat down at my new piano, a beautiful concert grand. I started composing again, not for community theater, but for myself. The music flowed easily now, unburdened by fear or financial anxiety. I finished the Kirano score, dedicating the final movement to Grandpa Arthur and Ilara Volkov. The dissonant grace notes were still there, but now they resolved into a powerful, soaring melody, a testament to freedom and resilience. 6 months later, I premiered a new symphony at Carnegie Hall. It was a success. After the performance, I was greeting well-wishers when a familiar figure approached me. It was Clara, looking impeccably stylish, but with a hint of strain around her eyes. "Bernard," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "The symphony was incredible." "Thank you, Clara." She hesitated, then leaned in close. "You know, Richard is facing serious legal trouble. The operatives are still active, but they're focused on tracking down the foundation's origins." "I know," I said calmly. "It's all protected." She looked at me, a genuine question in her eyes. "Why did you do it, Bernard? Why give up the power?" I smiled, looking out at the crowd, at the life I had built on my own terms. "Because, Clara," I said, finally free. "I realized that the only thing truly worthless is a man who lets someone else write his score." I turned back to the crowd, leaving her standing alone, surrounded by the music she had once dismissed and the wealth she had failed to understand. My score was complete, and it was magnificent.